October 15, 1978, Sanders Theater, Harvard University. Professor Jonathan Mills stood behind his mahogany podium with the kind of intellectual arrogance that only comes from decades of believing you're the smartest person in every room. In front of him sat 500 students and faculty members, and across from him sat Muhammad Ali, fresh off reclaiming his heavyweight title for an unprecedented third time. What was supposed to be an evening celebrating the world's most famous athlete would instead become the most devastating intellectual takedown in Harvard's history. But not in the way Professor Mills had planned. In the next 20 minutes, Ali would ask one simple question that would shatter 44 years of academic superiority and reduce one of Harvard's most formidable intellectuals to tears in front of hundreds of witnesses. This is the incredible true story of the night Muhammad Ali proved that the deepest wisdom doesn't come from textbooks, but from the human heart, and why sometimes the most profound question you can ask someone is about their father. If stories about unexpected wisdom and the power of human connection move you, subscribe for more incredible moments that prove intelligence comes in many forms. Professor Jonathan Mills was everything that represented intellectual authority in 1970s America. At 52 years old, he was the author of 7 books on moral philosophy, held endowed chairs at 2 universities, and had built his entire career on the foundation that academic achievement was the highest form of human development. To Mills, there was a clear hierarchy in the world. At the top were the educated elite like himself, and far below were the masses who confused fame with wisdom, athletic prowess with intellectual depth. When Harvard's Distinguished Speakers Program announced that Muhammad Ali would be giving a lecture on sports and social responsibility, Mills saw an opportunity too good to pass up. He specifically requested to serve as the evening's moderator, not to honor the champion, but to publicly expose what he considered the intellectual fraud of celebrity worship in American academia. Mills had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had crafted questions designed not to elicit wisdom from Ali, but to reveal what he assumed would be the boxer's intellectual limitations. In Mills' view, Ali represented everything wrong with American society's tendency to elevate entertainers and athletes to the level of philosophers and moral leaders. As the evening began, Sanders Theater was packed beyond capacity. Students filled every seat, lined the walls, and crowded the aisles, eager to hear from the most famous athlete in the world. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Everyone knew they were about to witness something special. Muhammad Ali entered wearing a simple black suit with a silver tie, his presence commanding the room without effort. His famous confidence was evident, but those who looked closely could see something deeper in his eyes. A thoughtfulness that suggested he understood this evening might be different from his usual speaking engagements. Professor Mills began his introduction with what he considered scholarly precision, but what everyone else recognized as thinly veiled hostility. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather tonight to hear from Mr. Muhammad Ali, a man whose achievements in the realm of physical combat are undeniable, but whose qualifications to speak on matters of social responsibility and moral philosophy remain, shall we say, questionable. The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the respectful academic introduction they had expected from Harvard's Distinguished Speakers Program. Mills continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the final word on any subject. In our modern age, we too often conflate celebrity with wisdom, athletic achievement with intellectual depth. Tonight, I propose we examine these assumptions through the lens of rigorous academic inquiry. Ali sat quietly in his chair, his expression calm but alert. He had faced hostile crowds before, had been called everything from traitor to fool by millions of Americans. But there was something particularly cutting about this kind of intellectual condescension, this suggestion that his thoughts and experiences were somehow less valuable because they hadn't been filtered through ivy-covered walls and leather-bound books. Mills turned to face Ali directly, his questions designed not to elicit wisdom, but to expose what he assumed would be intellectual limitations. Mr. Ali, you've spoken extensively about your religious beliefs and their influence on your refusal to serve in Vietnam. Can you explain in philosophical terms the ethical framework that guided your decision? What canonical texts did you study? Which moral philosophers informed your thinking? The audience held its breath. Everyone knew this was a trap, an attempt to make Ali look foolish by demanding academic credentials he had never claimed to possess. The professor was essentially asking Ali to prove his intelligence using the very academic language and references that Mills himself had spent decades mastering. But Ali's response was not what anyone expected. Instead of defending himself or attacking his questioner, instead of falling into the intellectual trap that had been so carefully laid for him, Ali leaned forward slightly and asked a question of his own, a question so simple, so unexpected, that it would change everything. "Professor Mills, before I answer that, can I ask you something?" Mills blinked, clearly caught off guard by this unexpected turn. The intellectual battlefield he had so carefully constructed suddenly seemed irrelevant. "What's your favorite memory of your father?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Mills stared at Ali, completely unprepared for this shift in the conversation. This wasn't intellectual discourse. This was something far more personal, far more dangerous to a man who had spent his career hiding behind academic jargon and theoretical frameworks. "I fail to see how that's relevant to our discussion of moral philosophy," Mills said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Humor me, Professor," Ali said gently, his voice carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with Mills' cold intellectualism. "I promise it connects to your question about my ethical framework. What's one moment with your father that still makes you smile when you think about it?" Mills hesitated. For a man who prided himself on controlling every conversation, on being prepared for every intellectual challenge, this shift in dynamics was deeply unsettling. The audience sensed something profound happening, though they couldn't yet understand what. Around the auditorium, 500 people watched as one of Harvard's most formidable professors struggled with a question that had nothing to do with books or theories or academic achievements, a question that cut straight to the heart of what it means to be human. Finally, Mills spoke, his voice softer than it had been all evening. "My father was a carpenter," he said slowly, each word seeming to surprise him as it left his mouth. "Not an educated man by your standards, I suppose. But when I was 8 years old, he spent an entire weekend building me a treehouse. Nothing fancy, just a few boards and some nails." As Mills spoke, something was happening to his voice. The academic authority was fading, replaced by something more vulnerable, more real. "He let me help," Mills continued, his eyes growing distant as the memory took hold. "Showed me how to measure twice and cut once. We worked together, and when we finished, he told me I was his best assistant." Ali nodded, his eyes never leaving Mills' face. There was no triumph in his expression, no sense of having scored a point in some intellectual game. Instead, there was genuine interest, genuine compassion for this man who was slowly rediscovering a part of himself he had buried beneath decades of academic achievement. "That's beautiful, Professor," Ali said. "Your father taught you something that day, didn't he? Not from a book, not from a lecture hall, but from love and time and patience. That lesson about measuring twice and cutting once. That wasn't just about carpentry, was it?" Mills found himself nodding, unsure why he was being drawn into this conversation but unable to resist its pull. His hands began to tremble slightly as childhood memories flooded back. The smell of sawdust, his father's patient voice, the pride he had felt in completing something together with his dad. "No," Mills said, his voice catching with emotion. "It was about being careful, thinking before acting, paying attention to details." But even as he said it, Mills realized that Ali was leading him somewhere deeper. The memory wasn't just coming back, it was coming alive. He could almost feel his father's rough, calloused hands guiding his small fingers as they held the hammer. He could remember the safety he had felt in that treehouse, how his father would climb up every evening just to sit with him and watch the sunset. For 30 years, Mills had dismissed these memories as sentimental nonsense, irrelevant to serious intellectual discourse. But now, under Ali's gentle questioning, he felt the profound love behind every nail his father had hammered, every board he had carefully measured. "That's right," Ali said, his voice warm with understanding. "Your father was a philosopher, Professor Mills. He just didn't have the degree to prove it. He taught you ethics through his actions, morality through his love, wisdom through his time. That treehouse wasn't just wood and nails. It was his way of saying you mattered." The lecture hall had fallen completely silent. 500 people watched as one of Harvard's most formidable intellectuals found himself face to face with truths he had forgotten he knew. Mills' carefully constructed world of academic superiority was beginning to crack, not under assault, but under the gentle pressure of recognition. Now, Ali continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who understood. He was teaching a lesson that would be remembered long after this evening ended. You asked about my ethical framework. Let me tell you about mine. Ali stood up from his chair and began walking slowly across the stage, his presence filling the enormous space of Sanders Theater. My framework comes from a father too, but not the one who gave me life. It comes from a man named Elijah Muhammad, who saw something in a young fighter from Louisville and taught him that real strength comes from knowing who you are. It comes from a mother who cleaned houses so her son could dream big. It comes from standing in front of the draft board and knowing that some things matter more than what people think of you. Ali's voice grew stronger as he continued, each word carrying the weight of lived experience. You want to know what philosophers influenced me? Let me tell you about an 8-year-old girl in Birmingham who walked past men with dogs and fire hoses because she wanted to go to school. Let me tell you about an old man in Montgomery who walked 11 miles to work every day for 381 days because he believed in dignity. These were my teachers, Professor Mills. Not because they had degrees, but because they had courage. Mills felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. His throat was tight, his eyes were stinging, and for the first time since graduate school, he wasn't sure he was the smartest person in the room. The arrogance that had defined his career was melting away, replaced by something he had almost forgotten how to feel: humility. But here's what I really want you to understand, Ali said, stopping directly in front of Mills. You think there's a difference between your father's wisdom and university wisdom. You think there's a hierarchy, with books at the top and lived experience at the bottom. But what if wisdom is just wisdom, Professor? What if the carpenter who taught his son to measure twice and cut once was doing the same thing as the professor who teaches ethics to Harvard students? The audience was transfixed. They had come expecting to see a celebrity give a motivational speech. Instead, they were witnessing something far more profound, a moment of genuine human connection that transcended every boundary of race, class, and education. Mills found his voice, but it was different now, softer, more uncertain. Mr. Ali, I think I owe you an apology. I came here tonight believing that intellectual achievement was the highest form of human development. I believed that my education, my books, my degrees made me superior to people like you, people like me. Ali asked gently. No, that's not what I meant, Mills said quickly, then paused. Actually, maybe that is what I meant. And maybe that's the problem. Mills stood up from behind his podium and walked toward Ali, his academic armor falling away with each step. I've spent my whole career building walls between different kinds of people, different kinds of intelligence, different kinds of worth. I called you here to expose you as a fraud, but you've shown me that I'm the one who's been living fraudulently. My father died 10 years ago. Mills continued, his voice thick with emotion. I gave the eulogy at his funeral. I talked about his work ethic, his honesty, his love for our family. But I never once mentioned his wisdom. I was embarrassed by his lack of formal education, ashamed that a Harvard professor had a father who worked with his hands. The transformation happening on stage was visible to everyone in the audience. Students who had come to see Muhammad Ali were witnessing something even more remarkable, the moment when intellectual pride gives way to human truth. Professor, Ali said, placing his hand on Mills' shoulder, your father would be proud of the man you've become, not because of your degrees or your books, but because right now, in this moment, you're showing the same courage he showed when he spent that weekend building something beautiful for his son. And that's when it happened. Professor Jonathan Mills, author of 7 books, holder of endowed chairs, one of Harvard's most respected intellectuals, broke down completely. 44 years of academic achievement, of intellectual superiority, of carefully maintained distance between himself and ordinary people. All of it crumbled in the face of Ali's simple, devastating kindness. The audience watched in stunned silence as Mills wept openly on stage, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions he had suppressed for decades. I've been so lonely, Mills whispered, the words barely audible, but somehow carrying to every corner of the enormous theater. I've spent my whole career proving I was smarter than everyone else, and I've been so lonely. I don't have any real friends. My colleagues respect my work, but they don't know me. My students fear me more than they learn from me. I've built a perfect intellectual fortress, and I've been dying inside it. Ali pulled Mills into an embrace that seemed to heal decades of self-imposed isolation. "Professor," he said, "intelligence without love is just sophisticated emptiness. You don't need to be alone anymore. Your father's love is still with you, and now you can share it with others." What happened next created a legend that would be told at Harvard for generations. Instead of finishing the planned discussion about sports and social responsibility, Ali and Mills spent the next hour having a genuine conversation about wisdom, love, and the different ways people find meaning in their lives. The audience listened as two men from completely different worlds discovered their common humanity. Mills shared more stories about his father's simple but profound lessons about integrity and hard work. Ali talked about the wisdom he had learned from watching his mother clean other people's houses while dreaming of a better life for her children. Together, they explored the idea that education comes in many forms and that the most important lessons often come from the people we love rather than the books we read. The evening that was supposed to be Muhammad Ali's intellectual humiliation became instead a celebration of the many different ways human beings can be wise. Students who had never seen their intimidating professor show vulnerability watched him laugh, cry, and acknowledge that he had as much to learn as anyone else in the room. The friendship that began that night lasted for the rest of Ali's life. Mills became one of the champion's most articulate defenders in academic circles, not because he had changed his mind about the importance of education, but because he had learned to see intelligence as something that exists in many forms. He began incorporating Ali's insights about practical wisdom into his philosophy courses, teaching students that moral development comes as much from lived experience as from theoretical study. More importantly, Mills reconciled with his own past. He began talking about his father in his lectures, sharing the carpenter's simple but profound wisdom with students who had never considered that their own parents might be philosophers without degrees. Mills wrote a book called The Treehouse Philosopher that became one of Harvard's most popular texts, exploring how practical wisdom and academic knowledge could complement rather than compete with each other. Years later, when Ali was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, Mills was among his most devoted advocates. The professor who had once tried to humiliate the champion spent countless hours helping to establish programs that would preserve Ali's legacy and continue his work in promoting understanding between different communities. Today, Sanders Theater displays a plaque commemorating that October evening, not because of what Muhammad Ali taught about boxing or social responsibility, but because of what both men learned about the many different ways human beings can be wise and the courage it takes to admit when we've been wrong about each other. The professor who tried to expose Ali as a fraud discovered instead that the greatest fraud was his own intellectual pride. And the champion who could have destroyed his attacker with words chose instead to heal him with a simple question about love. Because sometimes the most profound wisdom comes not from proving how smart you are, but from helping someone else remember what they already knew in their heart. That every father who builds something beautiful for his child is teaching philosophy, and every act of love is a masterclass in what it means to be human. The question that made a Harvard professor cry wasn't about academic theory or intellectual frameworks. It was about a treehouse, a father's hands, and the universal truth that wisdom comes in many forms, including the form of a boxer who understood that the strongest victory is the one that heals rather than destroys.